Hi everyone, welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell, and today on our show we have Amer Latif. Amer is a professor of religious studies at Marlboro College. He's also published translations of the poetry of Rumi, the 13th century Muslim scholar and mystic. And he's also given talks through the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. So we are here today with Amer. Thank you, Amer, for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Wendy.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure being here.
It is. It's great to have you on. You grew up in Pakistan.
Yes. I grew up in Islamabad, the capital area.
Uh-huh.
And I came to the U.S. When I was 18 for college.
Mm-hmm. Do you go back to Pakistan?
I do. I have a young family, 2 young boys.
Yes.
And we try and go back every year as much as possible to try and stay connected with the family.
Uh-huh.
And it's been really lovely to have the boys connected that way. And
that's great.
So we usually leave in, when it's winter time, so that's nice and warm over there.
That's a smart move. Very good.
Yeah.
And have you noticed when you go back, has there been a lot of change? Like you grew up in the 70s there, right?
Yeah, I was born in the 70s, so really 80s was the time when I was a teenager, and I came to the U.S. in 1990. So yes, I mean, there have been quite significant changes, and the first one that is immediate is the amount of population increase.
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's, I would say, almost doubled, or a little bit less than double than when I was growing up. So when I go back, the sense of the place is a lot more crowded. And because of the population increase, there's also a lot more young people. Around 2005 or so, and my wife also noticed this. We had been to Pakistan before that, one trip. And the second trip we went, all of a sudden, there were, I think, 3 times as many cars on the road.
Oh.
Because a certain kind of banking had come into the country. I mean, there was an opening up to the international banking system. The government relaxed some of its regulations, and what that meant, that banks were giving a lot of loans out so people could afford things on loan that they could not afford otherwise. So that really was, I think, not anticipated by a lot of the city planners. So for example, just to take the case of Islamabad, where I grew up, it was one of the few planned cities in Pakistan. It was, planned in 1960, so it literally has a central place called 0 Point, and from that, the whole city is laid out in grids. So it's really interesting. But what the planners did was they took care to include huge swaths of green areas.
That's so great. Yeah.
But after 2005, 2006, because of the increase in the number of vehicles, most of these green areas had to be paved into roads. So it's like fascinating to watch what has happened even to a planned city where the rate of increase one could not have anticipated it. And I think it says something about our limited imagination.
Yes, I do. I agree with you on that. I agree. And also that so much of it seems to be economically driven.
Yes, absolutely. A lot more people are commuting, and in the last 7 or 8 years especially, I've seen a change in the work culture where when I was growing up, the idea that parents would be out of the house in the evening was fairly uncommon. It was rare. And now, inevitably, a lot of the parents are not at home in the evenings because the companies are demanding more and more time. So there's been a very interesting effect of development on family structures and on what kind of time kids are spending with their parents.
Those kind of changes that are not only global, but when it comes from your hometown, you really see it and feel it in a different kind of way. Let's go to, okay, you were studying physics. You came to study physics and engineering, and now it's religious studies. So how did you get from A to B?
I had been very interested in liberal arts education. So in Pakistan, after high school, I'd gotten admission into an engineering institute. So I was doing mechanical engineering, but it was all technical subjects. Like for 1 year, 8 technical subjects. And it was just stifling.
Yeah.
And a year before that, I discovered the idea of the liberal arts, which really harmonized well with what I had known of the pre-modern Islamic education system, where distinctions between disciplines were not really there. So the same person would be studying, like Rumi, for example, he's known for his poetry, but he was also a lawyer, legal scholar, a jurist. And he had studied all of the sciences of his days. So like in his poetry and his work, you see him speaking about physics as well. And he'd studied logic, he'd studied rhetoric, he'd studied the literature of the day, he'd studied the sciences of the day. He was a jurist. And then all of that sort of goes into making the person you are, so that you have a kind of a, overview of cultural products and culture in a very comprehensive way.
Yes.
So even as a child, I remember when I encountered these people, I was told about them, I was really taken by that idea of not being a specialist only. Somebody who's at home in multiple areas and is able to see connections.
Yeah.
So, so liberal arts seemed to promise that. There was the only model I saw that actually said, hey, you don't need to specialize immediately. So I was able to find a program where I would do 3 years, and I came to Bard College, and I would do 3 years there in physics and study the liberal arts material, philosophy, literature that I was interested in studying, and then be able to go to Columbia for 2 years and do engineering. So that was the program under which I came, under which my parents allowed me to come, really. Because, okay, so you can go do your liberal arts and you'll still at least become an engineer. And once I came, slowly the questions started to become more and more questions of meaning, more philosophical questions, and the engineering fell off first. I studied physics and maths, and I actually ended up graduating with a degree in physics and math, but even there, having taken enough philosophy and literature and other sociology and political science, the larger questions emerged. And I discovered Rumi in college. It was a professor there. I never took a class with him. Professor Bill Mullen, really amazing human being, just passed away last year. So it feels good to be able to speak of him in that way. Never took a class with him, but he was a person who was very interested in students and what students had to think. And as a foreign student with some other friends from Pakistan and other countries, I would stay on campus because I didn't have the resources to go back. He wanted to learn about the classical literature and thinking of all cultures. So in my sophomore year, he was studying Persian Islamic culture. And he was the one who came and asked me questions about Rumi and about Iqbal. Iqbal is the philosopher-poet of Pakistan. And Iqbal has this book called the Javed Nama, which is named after his son. But it is structured as a series of ascents through the seven heavens, much like Dante's Divine Comedy. And whereas for Dante, it is Beatrice, Beatrice who is his guide, love that takes him through the seven heavens into the, the presence. For Iqbal, it is Rumi.
Yeah.
Rumi was his guide.
That's fascinating. So, what a great correlation.
So I had known of Rumi before. I had grown up memorizing part of Iqbal. Iqbal had been around. But for it to surface in my life at that moment, for somebody, an American, a person that I respected a lot, for him to be so interested, and for him to ask me questions. And at that moment I started realizing that I knew something about my culture, but I really did not know it in depth as I knew parts of physics. So that was a very important turning point for me.
Yes.
I was like, I need to understand
your
this.
heritage too,
Exactly.
your legacy, your heritage, all of that you actually probably was in your bones. And you teach comparative religion, really, which I think is so interesting. You mentioned an uncanny resemblance that you found between reading the Quran and the Bible.
Yes. That's one of the fruits of learning about different traditions and trying to compare them and set them side by side. And I found that if one were to go beyond some of the surface elements, the morphology or the structure is quite similar. And different traditions bring out similar ideas in different fashion. And if one were to look at it from the perspective of individuality and uniqueness, it is specifically our small differences that make us unique from each other. And yet, aspirin usually works on all human beings. So there's something about the human being that is physiologically and biologically across time and across cultures stable enough that something like aspirin can work on them. So there's a stability there. There's something that makes us who we are. So in a similar fashion, in order to deal, what I realized, and I think this is the way I'm putting it these days, this is the freshest version of it for me, is that different religious traditions have answered basic questions about the same being in different ways and in different historical circumstances, given the atmosphere, given the other physical forces, the material forces that are present. Those answers take different shapes and forms. And yet, because they are responding to the being that is constant, there's a similarity with them.
Right.
So not to deny the differences,
Right.
which in fact some people might on that basis argue that each is unique on its own term. So I would say yes, each human being is unique, but aren't all human beings similar as well?
Yes, that's
But
right.
comparative religion has allowed me to actually be able to go beyond saying that they're similar, to be able to talk about in what ways are they similar and what level are they similar.
And,
know.
and what have you found? I know that you found many things.
Yeah,
Amer,
I mean, just
you
to give the
know.
example that we spoke about a little bit earlier on, what was uncanny for me was I looked at some parts of the Gospels while I was working with some students, and I noticed the way in which one of the parables of Jesus, first of all, a lot of the things that Jesus is saying feel very familiar to me, not just as a scholar, but as somebody who was brought up in an Islamic milieu, in the Quranic worldview. The message seemed very similar, but there are also slight differences too. But there were certain passages where the similarities were uncanny. And what was uncanny was when I actually looked at the original, the Greek from which we get the English version. So there's the parable of the rich man who comes to Jesus, and this is present in the 3 synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and asks Jesus, "Good teacher, what must I do in order to be saved?" Or in other versions, in order to inherit the kingdom of God, in order to have eternal life. So there's slight differences in translations. And with a friend who was a classicist, I went back. My Greek is not as good, so I wanted an expert's opinion. So we sat together with this text, and the syntax, the way in which Jesus says that, is exactly the syntax of "there is no God but God." There's none good but the one who is good. There's no God but God. And that for me was just really, really striking.
Yes.
So that, if I speak as a scholar of religion, it points to a certain historical chain, I can give that explanation. When I speak of it as a Muslim,
Right.
it confirms some of the teachings that I had heard growing up, that the same message has been sent to all prophets, and Jesus in the Quran is called a prophet.
A prophet, right.
So what he was saying in that passage is no different than what the Quran is saying about generally speaking. So it was really gratifying on both levels, and that's why I then ended up using that parable as a way to, not parable, that story as a way to frame some of the Quranic teachings about the world and about God.
And also the commonality that that you speak of as well. And you said so many interesting things. One of which was in Islam, the renewal cycles.
This was a concept that I became familiar with even as a kid. There was a title that was given to certain really great thinkers whose names we would hear, and it seemed like they were present throughout different kinds of centuries. So Ghazali, who's considered to be a very famous Muslim scholar, he died in I think it was 1111. So about 500 years after Prophet Muhammad's death, and he titled his great work, which is a big 4-volume work called Ahya Ulumuddin, which is giving life to the sciences of religion. So from the root for life, Ahya. And then this title, from the same root we get the word Muhyi, which means the life giver, the revivifier, who really breathes in vitality into a form. That is used for many other thinkers. And then I came across the idea that in every century, some Muslim thinkers would say, there is a person who is able, through absorbing the knowledge of the tradition from the past, and through absorbing and being open enough to the current circumstances, is able to renew what has been received and present it in a form that then addresses the needs of the people of his or her time.
Right. Because the culture changes and people
Exactly,
change,
yeah.
and yeah, that's very interesting.
So that person would be a revivifier.
These are big breakthroughs, right, in terms of not only our commonality, but the religions that are holding these truths and these experiences and stories. A lot of these ideas, not that they're new ideas, but I think they're expanding ideas. You know, there are things about Islam that we don't necessarily know about. How do your students respond to these differences and also these commonalities?
I think it depends on how one presents it, and I've learned over a period of time to try and make sure that what they're encountering in whatever class they take with me, whether it's introduction to the Bible, introduction to Islam, or introduction to Buddhism, or Hinduism, or whatever tradition I'm teaching at that moment, that I try and bring across certain recurring perennial kind of themes, so that they're able to see, like I was saying earlier, how it is that a certain group of human beings responded to challenges that humans were facing in one moment. So it's not just to read it as a historical curiosity, but to actually something to learn from, so that one might take something from it and be able to apply it to one's own situation.
And to feel it in oneself.
Exactly.
You know, which is sort of the whole point of each religion, right, is that it all comes back to oneself.
Right. So for students, I try and frame it in that way for them, that here are the ideas. So the challenge is always how to respond to what we have received. So for example, this next semester, I'm teaching a course on Confucianism and Taoism with my fellow professor at Marlboro of Asian Studies, Seth Harter, and we have titled it Wrestling with Ancestors.
Great.
So the whole idea is that what we do is that we cannot choose where we're born. We're born into a culture, but what we receive, we then engage with. And a lot of times it's this kind of a push and pull. And I think wrestling, the image of wrestling is so great because it really evokes the closeness and the sweatiness, and really like you're with the other person. It's not a kind of a distanced kind of an engagement, right?
And it's not mental.
Exactly, exactly. So much like, Jacob wrestles with God, or some people say the angel in the night, and hence gets the name Israel. So Israel means the one who wrestles with God,
I didn't know that.
Yes, it's a beautiful, I mean, it was a real discovery for me too when I, as a student came across that. And so I think that's how I learned from other traditions, and my own. So the students, I really put the challenge to them. I said, you are part of a small group who's going to be in college, right? So you are being given the opportunity to engage with your own tradition, and not just this tradition, but a world tradition through different classes. But why are you doing that? So that you can respond to the challenges of today and the challenges that will come later on, so that it becomes a continuity rather than simply being placed in a small box. Or that's religion, and that was that culture and society.
Right, and it's pertinent and becomes part of one's life. One thing also that struck me is this real feeling of humanality that you talked about, and I think with Rumi as well, I think, you really feel the humanness when you read Rumi's poetry. Yeah,
that was something that really attracted me about Rumi when I discovered him as an undergraduate. So, I realized at that moment that I had developed my rationality to a high degree, but I had very meager knowledge of other parts of my being. So just, we're able to name things in the physical domain with much more ease. And even in mathematics, where the ideas and the things we're working with are a set of relations, they're totally abstract concepts. I was so good at that, but I was very bad at being able to name and work with stuff that was very real, very important. So I saw a real weakness there and a real lack, and it caused me suffering. So Rumi appeared as an answer, and especially for me at that time, I feel, and even now, I think there are people like Rumi. There's, of course, in every tradition there are people like Rumi, and there's many other people like Rumi in the Islamic tradition even, who are able to not let go of either the head or the heart. So that was not an option for me, because I saw the value of reason, I saw the importance of science, but in what container to contain that science, how to use it, what values should inform it, and what about the heart, what about feelings, what is the place of that? How does one name it and how does work with it? So Rumi does that beautifully, I think.
No, and I was thinking about all of this, and with Rumi in mind, because he's become so popular. It's amazing. In a very short period of time, he's become, one of the best-selling poets in America.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
It's very remarkable.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about it, and the poetry of the saints, which you also spoke about, and the fact that Rumi would take a lot of these concepts and ideas and bring his own story to it, or tell it as his story.
Yes.
But the poetry, what is it about poetry that it reaches a different place than prose does, or maybe goes beyond it, or and story as well? But poetry, I think, is very different.
I guess poetry, then, by definition, would be that kind of a discourse, that kind of utterance, that does something to us, right? Mm-hmm. That does something in terms of either engendering a quality in us, or perhaps in doing that, we participate in what the poet is experiencing. So, and that, I feel, is the opening up of a new perspective. Mm-hmm. So I think good prose can do it too, where an author brings you to a perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think that's in some ways really what human beings crave. Mm-hmm. This is, I think I'm coming more and more towards articulating in that fashion. Yeah. Ibn al-Arabi, another 13th century Muslim saint and scholar, I think he paraphrased, one of the Greek teachers, one of the philosophers, but in his own way, he says that the soul's need for knowledge is greater than the body's need for food. Uh-huh. And one of the problems that I had, Wendy, I realized, was that I had limited knowledge to information and limited knowledge to the physical world. And that's in some ways what science does, because it needs to be able to manipulate things, it needs to be able to replicate the material. Mm-hmm. But what is being spoken of there was something different. Because there's also sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, for example. He said, to be a person of faith is to seek knowledge from cradle to the grave. Mm-hmm. And seek knowledge even unto China. So travel far in the seek of knowledge. Mm-hmm. So that always, growing up, I thought it was science and technology. Right. That's what it's meant. Right. But then slowly, as I grow older, I start realizing it was perhaps meaning something different. And there's a great story that depicts this. When it would rain, they say Muhammad would go out, Prophet Muhammad, would go out into the rain and take off his turban and let the rain fall on his head. Mm-hmm. And his friends, companions asked him, why is that? And he said, the rain is freshly arrived from God, so I'm letting it touch. So there's a freshness. Yeah,
that's beautiful.
So I think that's what he meant. It was about this basic movement we have in life, when we've all known boredom. Mm-hmm. And I think what he was talking about was how to get rid of boredom, was to make things fresh and new. So learn about the thing in a new way. That's how that speaks to me right now. Yes. Because in Arabic, the word for knowledge is ilm. From the same root, we have the word for the cosmos. It's alam. And the word for a knower is alim. And the word from the same root is alam, which means flag. So in this way of thinking, I realized that for the person, Ibn Arabi, who said that, soul's need for knowledge is greater than the body's need for food, he says how everything in creation is a flag that is a pennant that is waving and is trying to give us its knowledge. So the problem arises when through boredom we lose our sense of freshness. Yeah. So that's why when we go to sleep, usually get up, it's better, or after meditating, or after exercising. Right. There are activities that we do after which the world feels fresher.
Yes, that's right.
Right?
And it's also bringing vivification to the things that we do.
That's exactly it, yes.
And I think that's refreshment as well, being refreshed, So reading Rumi, my experience anyway, and I think for a lot of people, are those things. It's like it's a fresh way of looking. The language is saying something that we haven't heard before in quite that way, whether it's syntax or whatever. Also, I know another thing, there's a great quote, the Lord lives inside the human heart.
Yes.
And again, bringing it back to our own selves, bringing it back to our bodies. Which of course includes our head, heart, and all of that. and also, love. All these guys are talking
Yes.
about love.
Love,
You
yes.
know, how do you see that?
This again, since we have this frame set up, I'll go back to it. So love for me was just a very emotional thing, an overpowering emotion. And I used to be surprised, initially even bemused, and kind of would feel like, what does a person mean when they say the world, is run by love? So Rumi would say the world is love, or it is the motive force of the cosmos.
Or love is all you need.
Yes, or
Yes,
love is all
yeah.
you need, right? Yeah. So that's been one of a really fortunate, I think, one of the good fortunes of studying Rumi and people like him, where I realized, and they also used to say, like, love is not created. It's like, what does it mean?
Yeah.
Love is not created.
Yeah.
So it turns out it all goes back to this style of thinking, in Islamic terminology at least, where there's a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad who says that Prophet David, who's also considered to be a Quranic prophet, so he asked God, why did you create the world? And God says, I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known. So I created creation so that I might be known. So the entire metaphysics, cosmology, and then the key to understanding Rumi's poetry is in there.
Yeah.
The fact, how is love uncreated? So before there was creation, God was, and God is, they say, and nothing was with him and nothing is with this reality.
Yeah.
This unique, solitary, individual oneness, a oneness of which we cannot even imagine. It's not the 1, 2, 3 of the number line.
Yes, right.
It's a oneness that has no other equivalent. It's that unique one.
Yeah.
But in that unique one was a desire to be known. So Ibn Arabi speaks of it in this way. He says, because, our knowledge of ourselves is not the same as our knowledge of ourselves in something else which serves as a mirror. So when I speak to students, I ask them this many times, like, so when you see a photograph, a group photograph in which you're there, who's the first person you see? And of course, everybody knows we always look for ourselves.
Yes.
And the simple question is, don't you know yourself? You've been living with yourself for this many years. Why do you still need to go find yourself? Or in a shop window when we're walking, right?
Yeah, it's part of the human condition. It's
Exactly.
wild.
So there's a desire to know oneself. So now this is being seen as a result of the root cause, which is pre-existent. Before existence came into being within God, God desires to know God's self, and hence humans desire to know their self. So this is one of the, so again, this would be an interpretation of the biblical made in the image of God.
That's right.
So this is, one of the consequences of that. So that's why love is what caused the cosmos to come into being, and love is what is then moving everything to seek itself, so to speak, or to see itself in a different way. And hence, love is all you need, is that when you realize that that is a restlessness within you, and in some ways that is actually the condition of existence, it is not going to disappear.
That's beautiful. And so, Rumi, yes.
That's what Rumi says. He says,
Rumi speaking of desire,
he's speaking
right?
of desire, and he calls it the incurable pain. So it's this restlessness. He says in the human being is an itch, a desire, a pain that nothing can fulfill except God. And even then, because God is infinite, we need to know more of God. So there's no escape from it. So this was a hugely strange, paradoxical way of answering the question of, like, no, don't try and get rid of it. Learn to know it and see where it's going. And you can direct its object, but there is no escape from it. So and then other Muslim saints speak of it beautifully too, that I kept on looking for a remedy for my pain until I realized that my pain was my remedy.
Yeah. And it's like a Zen koan as well.
Exactly. It's
right?
non-dual.
Yeah,
and
you
duality you move
can't
to
get there
non-duality.
through the mind. You can bring the mind into it, but that's not the route to take.
Right.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, Amer, we just whipped right through that. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's such a pleasure.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's wonderful to have you on and to have this whole thing expand. Thanks to all of you for being with us today for this really great conversation. We hope to have more and more of these conversations. So thank you for tuning in. We are a weekly show, and we're always happy to have you. See you next time.